Welcome back to Killer Cure. At Seed, we're focused on preventing disease before it starts, and that mission intersects powerfully with today's guest. From launching the UN AI for Good Summit to advising on global tech policy and investing in future-defining startups, he's a futurist and force behind many of the most important tech for good movements today. Welcome, Stephen Ibaraki, futurist, venture capitalist, and founder of the UN AI for Good Global Summit and Reds Capital. Stephen, if you would please give us a quick overview of your background, and let's kick this off for a lively discussion around health, tech, and really all the advocacy that you bring to the table.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. It's kind of awesome to be with you two. You guys are two of the amazing contributors, investors, entrepreneurs, and really making a great global contribution. I was reading when I was 3 encyclopedias, and I built my first computer when I was 10. But I was talking to my wife today, and she says, well, everybody does that. But keep in mind, this was in 1965, and we didn't have computer chips then, and things like that, right? We were vacuum tubes and transistors and wires. It actually had a kind of like an expert system built into it. And then I worked on the first commercial microcomputers after that. And keep in mind, back in the 60s and 70s, when you built these things, they had no operating system. There was no Windows 11. There was no Mac OS. You actually had to write all of that from scratch. So when I was talking to Bill the other day, I could relate, right? I wrote a machine code, and then when assembler came along, I was like magic. And then, of course, when you went to C. So I saw that entire evolution, and that was in the 70s. And then I worked on the first and built actually the first enterprise micro network systems for the pharmaceutical industry, and it was the first medical database systems at the time in the 80s, including with AI embedded in it. And in fact, for the group that I built that for took them to about 80% market share in the radiopharmaceutical industry. So it's the first implementation from mainframes and mini computers into micro implementation. So I've been doing this kind of my whole life, and starting companies and things like that, have exits or social enterprises. And I'll bring you up to maybe the current time, and that's where I had this idea of AI for Good, brought it to the UNITU back in 16, and then that became AI for Good. In fact, AI for Good is on this week, and we are the largest sustainable AI solutions program in the world. Our audience last year was about 3 billion, so this year it's bigger, so I imagine it'd be over 4 billion audience. And we have all these different programs globally, including in healthcare as well. So I'm involved with computing organizations, the UN, CEOs, with academic organizations, run the board, et cetera, et cetera. So, but everything, even from when I was a kid, when I was 3 and 4, I was really interested in the application of tech for good purposes. And of course, underneath that, as a subset, would be AI for Good.
Amazing. When you were going through all that, I mean, do you still have your encyclopedias, by the way, just as a backup in case something, I have a whole shelf full still that my parents collected them, it seems. So reading encyclopedias is not foreign. When it comes to like how you took the journey of being such a performer at Microsoft and doing all the things that you did, and then combining that to really being an advocate for all the proactive things happening today, what really, from going from one level to really what I would consider the top level of work, meaning front edge of all tech, front edge of innovation at a time where it's moving so fast. What really drove that? A lot of people might have said, well, I've accomplished it all at Microsoft, or I've done X, Y, and Z. And for me, it's evident you haven't accomplished it all. You still have things to do and are doing them and making a big impact. So maybe what drove that?
That's a really great question. So you're asking me what sort of drove my passion for tech for good or social good, and also technology. And that's because my family was very entrepreneurial, and they immigrated into North America like over 100 years ago, and they built enterprises and things like that. But what happened in the Second World War, my grandparents were Canadians, and my parents, but they were interned. And they never really, in fact, they never talked about it. Really got a better idea when I got quite a bit older. But from that experience, they really instilled in us to really focus on social good, to giving back to other people, thinking about the other and the other's experience, kind of living their experience. And then how could you contribute to make it better in some way? So I would say that would be the kind of the guiding force, and then the entrepreneurship, sort of theme that ran in my family. Now, keep in mind, when my family was an intern and when they were released, they were basically immigrants again. So even though, we were came into this country over 100 years ago, and they had built enterprises, banks, and things like that, they basically, the government took everything away from them. So when they were released from the internment camps, they were essentially immigrants, so they had to build everything from scratch. And so when I said that I was reading encyclopedias when I was 3, my parents really had nothing. Everything was taken away from them. So they spent everything they could. And so we had like 10 different kinds of encyclopedias, and they really emphasized this idea of knowledge and by implementing that knowledge for good. And one of the encyclopedias they had was on science, and another was on culture, and another was on knowledge, and there's a whole series of them. So I got a really good perspective of cultures around the world, innovations in science, about general knowledge, and they would get updates every month. So that and kind of the family ethos guided me to be very entrepreneurial, but think about tech, think about how you can have social impact. And my parents, my families always indicated that you never achieve a sort of ultimate expertise. It's like when I studied martial arts, right? When I was younger, you could have a black belt, or you could have a fifth degree black belt. You never really master. You're always constantly on this journey of learning. So the same thing with my parents. They were saying that you constantly strive to learn, but part of that learning you also give as well, and you work in servant leadership. And how can you serve others?
100% agree that mastery is a journey, not a destination. I
Yeah,
have a follow-up question, which is a little more technical. When you look at tech for good or doing good in general, how do you think about the second order and third order effects of what you're doing? So I'll give you an example. If you give somebody a pair of shoes in a developing nation, you may improve their life significantly as a first order effect. As a second order effect, you may reduce the income of a local cobbler. And that second order effect, if you put that cobbler out of business, actually disables that society from being able to make their own shoes in the future. I'm not saying you've got to be cold and heartless. I'm just saying, do you think about second order effects of doing good or third order effects? How do you map that out holistically?
That's really, really fascinating. When I was, again, really, when I was really young, I actually wrote about what life is like today. I wrote about that we were going to live in a period of kind of polarization, where you had people with means and others, people who don't have access. And then I wrote about the implications of all of that. And so when I was like 10, I was sort of predicting where we are today, 60 years into the future. And then when I was working with microcomputers, I was picking 50 years into the future, 40 years. So I was continually kind of looking at the future and its implications. Let's bring that up to 2018, because I was always looking at the implications of all of this. I did a private kind of a briefing to the heads of AI, or the heads of tech, for the UN agencies, and I really was predicting where everything was today. And I indicated that because of the polarization that's occurring, how are you going to manage that? Because of the confluence of all the different kinds of technology and the implications that's going to have, how are you going to manage that? And you better be prepared. And even though at that time I was saying that quantum computing was going to be much more real than it was back in 2018, I remember people thinking, or I would get feedback that, maybe that's 2100 or 2200 or, it's 50 or 100 years out. And I said, no, you need to start prepping for this now. And I, at the time, and keep in mind, I was even doing this back in the 1980s. I was saying that we're going to have AI, which would be conversational music. You can integrate with it. You would think that it's like an entity. And again, when I was trying to prep the UN at the time, there was this kind of idea that maybe it was going to be 50 years out and they had a lot of time. And I said, no, it's going to converge now. So I was indicating to them, then we're going to have to look at, what does that mean from an employment standpoint? What does that mean from the different kind of disparities that occur across the world? How do we sort of allow the democratization, or maybe I shouldn't even use that word, but sort of the equity aspect of it, right? So everybody can utilize this tech, and how could do this in advance. And because I've been embedded in formal computing organizations like KIPS, the Canadian Information Processing Society, we're the oldest computing society in Canada. I'm actually past president and chair of the board of that organization. But we've been looking at this back in the 80s and even in the 70s, right? In fact, one of our founders actually wrote the first paper with his colleagues for the UN, for the Secretary General, on the economic impacts of technology, and what does that mean, and how do you prepare? So, and the ACM, we're over 70 years old. We've been also looking at this and what the implications are. And we're number one in computing science, and I'm embedded with them. I've been on board of our committees of the ACM since 2009, and then there's the IEEE. We're the oldest technology engineering organization, and I'm embedded in them as well. And then, of course, we've been looking at this as even the implications of AI and producing operational guidelines. In other words, if you're going to implement technology, what does that mean? How do you do it so it's safe? What are the implications of this? And this is embedded in our journals and our conferences. If you combine the ACM, Association of Computing Machine, with the IEEE, we produce over 2,000 conferences and journals, and we have sub-organizations. And in fact, under the ACM, we helped create something called the Computer Science Teachers Association, which is a K-12 organization. And how do you prepare K-12 kids for the implementation of computing science and the implications they're going to have? It's a great question, but it's a layered question and layered response, and that's why even before the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, I was pitching internally within the UN and within the different computing societies that you're going to have to look at the implications of technology, and then what are the secondary, tertiary effects of this technology and the impact it's going to have, and you better prepare. What happened, if you look at the Millennium Development Goals that came in 2000, basically the UN did not consider the impact of technology, right? You won't see them in the Millennium Development Goals if you look back. However, I had the opportunity to actually do interventions in New York prior to the release of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I was indicating again, you have to look at the impact, not just of AI, but all aspects of technology. And that's why you see the Sustainable Development Goals have a recognition and implementation of, and what are the tertiary and the other impacts of technology. And that's why once the Sustainable Development Goals were released in 15, I then went to the ITU. And the reason the ITU is I was participating in the World Summit called the WSIS since 2012, which is looking at the implications of technology, but also all the other aspects of communities, and then the impact it's going to have globally and on everybody's lives, right? So because I had that relationship back from 2012, and once the Sustainable Development Goals came out in 2015, then I formally approached the UN ITU. And the reason the ITU is that they're 160 years old. So they predate the UN, and they're the only UN agency that combines governments with corporations and research groups and other UN agencies. And the reason is that standards were required back over 100 years ago. And so you had an organization that had to work across those communities. And that's why at the WSIS, the World Summit in 2016, I actually requested a meeting with some of their people, and then I pitched them on saying, what about the implications? Why don't we do something more? And then how about AI for social good? And that became AI for good. So, but AI for good is not just looking at, wow, it's going to, improve and optimize companies, or it's going to optimize performance. It's also what are the impacts it's going to have, and how do we manage that, and how do we bridge that digital divide. So if you look at AI for Good, they have a program called Partners to Connect, and that's to enable all the digital capabilities of all 8+ billion on the planet. They have an impact initiative to ensure that that will be sustainable across all the different countries and diverse roles around the world. They're working with UNESCO on a program called GIGA to connect all schools and making sure there's equitable access. And then looking at what are the impacts of that. And I'm part of something called the CEO Leadership Alliance. And back in 2020, they approached me. In fact, it was June of 2020 to join a private working group. And they were looking at the impact of technology. And I said, well, why not AI? So we created an AI talent initiative, but for K to 12, very diversity kind of oriented. And that's now become the National Talent Collaborative, working with, I guess, now over 30 leadership groups around the US. So not just looking at technology, but the kind of distortion and other impacts of technology. And it's a great question. So let's get practical. How do you get involved? AI for Good actually has a neural network platform. Anybody can join, and you can connect with others to work on all of these different programs that not only look on the implementation of technology, but also then what are the impacts of it? How can you ensure there's equitable access, and how do you manage that equitable access? And in fact, I told you back in 2018, I did a private briefing to the technology heads of the UN, and I mentioned quantum computing. They were thinking these things are going to be like, if it ever came about, maybe like 50 years, 100 years out. You realize the UN declared this year the year of quantum. So, so a recognition that we better look at.
So 50 turned into 5 years.
And but they can join the neural network. It's an open platform, right? And they can join all the different kind of programs that they have. You can join the IEEE. You can join the ACM. You can join another organization called IFIP, and I'm embedded in them as well. And we're a federation or alliance of different technology organizations, and we have all sorts of programs to look at all of these other impacts.
That's a great answer.
One of the things that, as somebody who created a large education or a large learning network for kids to learn to code, one of the things that I'm hearing from people these days is, oh, well, kids don't need to learn to code. AI can do that now. Care to share any thoughts about that?
That's again, it's a great question. In fact, I do a lot of private events. So I should mention to the audience, the majority of what I do is under some kind of NDA, and some of the work is under sort of like a security envelope. And I can't sort of talk about it a lot, but I get that question a lot, whether in public events or in private events, right? The thing is, and Bill, because we had an earlier discussion, the fact that you coded really early on, the fundamental understanding helps you when you look at things today, right? So you have a computing science background, software development background. That's going to help when you're getting AI to code for you, and because you can look at ways to optimize it, or you can look at ways that you can even prompt it better, right? Because you have a much better understanding of what's the underlying systems with this. And Bill, you and I, we're so early that when the microprocessors came out, we had to understand the registers and the instruction set of the CPU, because you would actually code at that level. And
Yep.
I remember when C came out, an assembler, the fact that I had a really fundamental understanding would allow me to optimize better in C or an assembler than if I didn't understand what was happening at the CPU level, right? So that training will always be valuable. And what will happen is you'll become more of an orchestrator than doing sort of, journeyman coding. But that fundamental understanding will help you when you become an orchestrator. This brings me up to, there was an unusual event happened at Berkeley a few weeks ago where 30 of the top mathematicians met in a mathematical forum, and they were working on tier one problems. Tier one problems are math problems that would take, let's say, 5 months or 6 months for them and their top grad students to solve. And they wanted to create these problems to test AI, right? And they used the O4 mini model, OpenAI, and so they would come up with a problem that they thought would take them a long time, but was solvable, but would take them a long time to solve. And they found that the O4 would, like, in 10 minutes, it would solve one of these problems that they thought was novel. There was no data on it out there. And it would be like this AI model would spend 2 minutes kind of researching. And then it would, one of them developed a toy kind of solution or a problem, kind of a subset of the big problem to see if it could solve it. And then in the remaining minutes, under 10 minutes, it solved the problem. And then the AI said, look, something like, I did it without citations. What it did, though, is it really shocked the mathematicians. And they even went public with it, that they didn't realize that these things could do this kind of abstraction at this level, right? So, and they theorized that maybe their role is going to change from solving fundamental math problems to being able to query on what these fundamental math problems and being an orchestrator to have the AI help them in finding solutions to fundamental math problems. So, and they came out with a public statement on this. So keep in mind, I'm kind of giving you an anecdotal sort of version
Yeah.
of this. I encourage the audience to go and get the real, search for it. You'll find the Berkeley math forum and what happened and some of the comments that they made. So anything I mentioned, do your own research because I'm just giving you an anecdotal kind of
I got two things to say about that. The first thing is just on the topic of second order consequences, right? There's actually a mathematical proof that shows that an AI can't debug its own code. And I would tell you that having used a coding AI, I can tell you that it really is bad at fixing anything that's wrong. Because fundamentally, it doesn't know how it wrote it. But even more than that, the way that AI codes, the test for whether the code is good is, does it run? And maybe does it do the thing I asked it to do? The second order effect is there is a proliferation of AI generated code out there now that has what I would term subtle bugs. These are bugs that don't stop the program from running, and they do allow a North Korean hacker to more easily access the user data that is being funneled through the app. And the AIs aren't learning about those hacking attempts because typically a North Korean hacker doesn't publish their work. Beyond that, when you look at people researching, I think AI is actually a very good research tool if you, again, prompt it the right way. The way I suggest people prompt it is go to Google Scholar, download several of the papers on Scholar, and just ask the model, the AI, to read those papers and restrict its answer to what's in the papers. It can summarize, etc., so you can understand it, but see if it can discern the positive and negative from the papers. And the results are actually pretty good. And there's less hallucination because you're limiting the data set.
That's a really interesting point, and it kind of speaks to your earlier question about making sure that you still have a great a fundamental foundation, let's say in computing science or in coding, right? Even as these things could take over this role. But I want to kind of point to something from Sakana, right? Sakana has this Japanese company, but they have U.S. Ties as well. And again, I encourage the audience to take a look, but they came out with this AI Scientist version 1, and then they came out with AI Scientist version 2 this year. And it has the capability to do a hypothesis, design experiments, write the code, check the code for quality, write a paper, and even check the paper, like audit the paper, and then it can be submitted. And it's now entering some of these top tier conferences and being accepted. It's not the best paper or things like that, but it's being accepted, right? Now, keep in mind, we're just at the beginning. And then Sakana this year just came out with the Darwin Godel model, which self-improves. In other words, it can self-improve its coding. So what it does, it goes to GitHub, looks at all the bug issues, and it's gone from maybe something like a 20% ability to find errors and correcting it to about 50%. But it does this on its own. So it's self-improving. And so I think that's really interesting. And then Alpha Evolve, if you look at what they've done from Google, gave it a bunch of math problems, gave 75% of state-of-the-art solutions, but it also improved 20% of that. It created improved the solutions, and then it also proposed novel solutions which hadn't existed before. And then Google is doing this to optimize their data centers, and so that's kind of like a picture where things are going, right? And then Sakana just released something I thought was really interesting, a paper on their multi-LLM. It's an adaptive branching multicolor tree search. And what it does, kind of fancy word for what it does, is it can use a number of different LLMs at the same time. It poses a problem to these multiple LLMs. It can ferret out what is considered to be the best solution for one of them, and it can continue to iterate on its own. And in fact, there was an AGI ARC-1 test, which was sort of thought to be defeated in November of last year, right? So they came out with this ARC-2, and this is this AGI kind of benchmark. what's happened is this new one from Sakana has now scored 30, and which is better than anything that's out there. So there's this kind of movement of having these things continually to iterate. What I encourage the audience to take a look at some of this work and then try to follow where it's going. And then also when you're prompting your AI, get it to look at its latent space. Ask it, look at your latent space, and then ask it to do further kind of self-reflection before it gives you a response so that it's doing a little bit more test time inferencing rather than giving you sort of a surface level response, and you'll get a better response. So what I'm trying to do is audience to kind of point you to things that you can look at, you can follow, and then see where it iterates from there. And Microsoft just released something like this multi-LLM adaptive branching multicolor search system from Sakana, but applied to the medical space. They went with hundreds of really hard to diagnose illnesses. They got a group of doctors to see how well they would do, and then they applied this kind of multi-LLM, and they would talk to each other, basically almost like a bunch of doctors talking to see what's the best diagnosis. And they outscored the doctors by 4x. But that's just the beginning. So again, I encourage the audience, just take a look. You're going to find holes in it, just like when I mentioned quantum computing in 2015 to a bunch of CEOs, the Financial Services Roundtable. People would find all sorts of holes that quantum's not going to happen. But you got to spend some time looking at the edge, at the outlier, like Vinod Khosla does, right? I did Vinod Khosla, one of the founders of Sun Microsystems and a really quite famous investor, and I did a sort of like a fireside chat for the ACM with him. And if you look at that fireside chat I did with him, he spends, I would say, several hours a day just reading on the edge. And I do the same thing. And if you want to find reliable information, again, go to the ACM Association. We have a daily news feed, or the IEEE, we have regular daily news feeds, and look at the edge. And you got to pay attention to some of that edge because that'll become mainstream.
I'll tell you, there's a lot in both of those conversations. You mentioned the sustainable development goals. We follow those. So those are, as far as our investment thesis is centered around the health and the access and the equity and preventative care and all of those things. And then you're right, Vinod is a great investor. We're co-investors in a particular project with him. So I did watch that interview. It was a great one. And we appreciate what you do there, Stephen. I think I want to double click on one thing, though. You mentioned healthcare and how Microsoft and Peter Lee and his group are doing things now, and how they're having multiple LLMs kind of sort through the differential that a doctor might go through. I think, we're in the crawl area when it comes to healthcare and adoption of AI and interpretation of data. I'm curious of your take on that. And I'd say crawl, walk, run, right? We're not running. The companies that I've seen that have been trying to attack and replacement of the physicians at the point of care or something like that have really had a lot of challenges. And that's, they've had a lot of challenges and they've gone out bankrupt. I mean, you're an investor, Ford or some of the others. And so we're all about disrupting healthcare and creating that new version that catches disease earlier, reverses the chronic illnesses, and allows for a more effective, more efficient process at a lower cost that we can then democratize. And that's what Bill was kind of driving at, right? How does this get democratized? So there's a few questions in there, and that how do you see that convergence, the crawl, walk, run methodology in healthcare, and how does it happen? Because there's a lot of confusion in that area. We're tackling it a variety of ways, but I'd be curious of your take.
It's really, really interesting. In fact, I did a South by Southwest, it must be like, 8 years ago with a doctor, just the two of us, right, for an hour. And at that time, and I'm not sure if the data has changed, but at that time I was saying, about 50% of these kind of recommendations that you get from a doctor are actually not based on data. It's just some hypothesis that becomes really popular and it becomes accepted practice, right? And so we got to have much more data-driven solutions, and the technology is there to do that. So you got this momentum that's sort of based on non-evidence, non-data-based recommendations when you do care, right? and that has a lot of momentum. And it reminds me of a couple of doctors or researchers that discovered that there was a bacteria that caused ulcers, and they couldn't get published, and there was a lot of push,
Helicobacter pylori.
and they ended up getting a Nobel Prize for that work, and that's because there's a lot of this inertia. So that's cultural, that, and that's going to be, that's the challenge. It's not the tech and the ability of the tech to make all these radical improvements and improve healthcare. So you got to make sure the doctors are really integrated in all of this. It's not replacing. You got to make sure that that aspect is maintained. And it's like radiologists, right? Really, AI could take a lot of burden. So let's not use the word replace, but take a lot of the burden from radiologists, right? And so you got to manage that conversation so that people don't think that it's going to be replaced, but it could help or improve, right? There's a company.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a huge, massive amount of detail you can get from an image today that you couldn't get several years ago, and that is something we lean on for diagnosing heart disease, as an example, or some other chronic illnesses. And avoiding the inferential diagnosis is kind of what you're suggesting, which I completely agree with. I think that's you're spot on about making sure that doctors are in the loop and that they correlate, instead of having one data point, have multiple data points, and instead of inferring the process or diagnosis or care delivery, leaning into the real answers, I think is key. So you're saying exactly what we think.
Yeah,
One of
So
the
spot on.
one of the biggest things that I see in the whole AI, actually, there are two things I see. One is that we don't have enough diagnoses. The literature and the entirety of medicine has an insufficient number of diagnoses for the number of actual conditions that are out there. And AI may, if it's allowed to, create new diagnoses that will be of greater efficacy than the entirety of medical knowledge to this date. At the same time, countervailing that very optimistic view is something that concerns me. Will we be able to democratize this before we inshitify it? Yeah, I'll give you an example. Everybody loves Duolingo, right? Like, Duolingo's been a smashing success. More and more people are looking at the AI version of Duolingo, which has been released. They fired a huge number of their humans and put in AI. And they've found that it's no longer a very good language learning tool. It's a compelling game. People like to keep their streaks. The reality is it's actually often wrong, even in the recommendations of phrases or its translation matrix. All these things all these bugs are creeping in. And they're subtle bugs, like I was talking about before. They're not, it doesn't work. They're, if you said this in context in the country, not only would you not be understood, you would be possibly drastically misunderstood. Yeah, and a human speaker immediately would know that you wouldn't say that, whereas an AI doesn't have that context. So I am curious, do you think we're going to get through the democratization point before we disable it with the insidification?
Yeah, I do. I believe that we will get to this proliferation, and there'll be wider acceptance, and there'll be the ability to reduce the hallucinations, and it'll be much more accurate. And you'll get more, be able to reproduce results and things like that. Because there's just so much research going into this, right? And people can see that the potential more and more. In fact, I was looking at this the other day. What is there? 5.3 million papers that are released out there right now, of which 3.3 million are in some kind of index citation database or something like that. So index citable papers, of which a big fraction of these are in technology and technology innovation. So it's not just AI, it's quantum computing and the intersection of quantum and supercomputing and chip technologies combined with AI and how you can orchestrate that to solve some really big problems. And I'll give you an example. Is Microsoft Discovery. It's still in kind of pilot phase, but they've announced it publicly. And you got some medical companies using it now. And that's because it combines all of these different elements. And for a fraction of the cost, you can create a new molecule, peptide or something like that, a biologic or a small molecule to solve some major problem. So this convergence and this democratization of all of these technologies, I call it the S10 and I call it a shift. I sort of given it a name, which I'll be propagating in some of my keynotes coming up. That convergence will allow more of the democratization first before, as you said, it becomes kind of all bad, right? Um, or the potential for not good, right? Or what I mean by that is the data is so bad, or isn't it performing so bad?
No, I mean, see, that's the thing. That's not what I meant. I'm not talking about the technological. I'm talking about the business model.
Yeah,
Insidification doesn't come through a technical flaw. It comes because either people don't think about how their business model is actually going to impact the result, or they don't care, or both. I could imagine a world, for instance, where a determined drug company could publish a very large number of papers through a very diverse number of researchers promoting a particular drug for a particular condition. And the AI would happily train itself on those outcomes published by trusted sources, air quotes. And you would actually, the drug company would be, co-opting the business model. That's independent of the AI company. Or the drug company could just simply pay the AI company to say, why don't you recommend our drug over that drug? This is where the business model of insidification, it moves very quick. And I'm not sure that we're going to get to democratization before we get to insidification.
that's really interesting. If you look at AlphaFold, right? If you went
Yep.
back 8 years before you really had this kind of AlphaFold technology, being proliferation is proliferating like last year with AlphaFold 3. The known sort of protein universe, and that is how amino acids fold into these 3D structures, proteins, and understanding that has tremendous implications, right?
Huge, massive. I mean, it's massively greater knowledge of protein folding structure now than we've ever had in human history, straight down to AlphaFold.
Yeah, prior to that, it was like 200 to 214,000. That's it. And it took decades to get there, right? Using X-ray crystallography or using this kind of other techniques.
Arguably, it took the entirety of human history to get there.
Yeah, and then literally in a year, over 200 million proteins, but with AlphaFold 3, but also the interaction between those proteins and RNA, DNA, and these molecules called ligands, right? Because if you understand those interactions, you can do much more. And then they've spun out Google has spun out a startup called Isomorphic Labs. Isomorphic Labs has raised, I think, this year successfully at 600 million, and they're going to clinical trials now, right, this year. And so now let's forecast. What does that mean? That means that you're definitely going to reduce the cost from, let's say, 2.4 billion in some of the early stages to maybe under in the hundreds of millions. You're going to be able to reduce the time from getting from concept to some kind of clinical study within a fraction of the time. So let's say 60% less time or maybe even greater, right? And in fact, over time, it'll condense and get shorter. And that's why, and again, I get the audience, I'm just going from memory, so you should verify what I'm saying, but Eli Lilly and I believe Novartis have already committed 80 million and then I think 3 billion based on milestones. And they get access. So they've seen the utility of the technology, right? So that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's another one called Akium, and I encourage the audience to look at that. They can produce a trillion space for doing and uncovering binders, like these kind of binders for drugs that can be used.
Conjugation molecules.
Yeah, yeah, and especially the disordered regions, right? Which is like, some people are saying that's like 50% of the protein space that is out there. And some of the hardest diseases to treat in some way. And Akium is saying they've got a trillion model, and that's like 1,000x better than anything else out there, right? Plus they have a wet lab. Plus they're generating, they got a flywheel effect where they're generating their own data, which will improve the outcomes of the system. And they've already got a major farm company where they've been able to address an internal problem. They address it, right? And 3 major hospitals as well. So, so you're seeing this kind of tip of the iceberg, right? And this is just going to accelerate. So that's where I think the democratization will still win out over what's going on.
The countervailing argument to that is that truth is much more expensive than fiction. even with an AI.
What I encourage the audience to do is there's something called Microsoft for Startups, and they partnered with NVIDIA, and of course, Microsoft has this relationship with OpenAI. It's a free platform. Any startup in the world can apply to it, and you can get like 150 up to $150,000 of free zero credits, non-dilutive. And because of some of the other benefits, I estimate maybe about 350K, a non-dilutive kind of value. And then within that program, they have something called the Pegasus program, which is their unicorn builder, where you get just access to a lot of stuff. And I know about it because on my laptop in front of me, I got all the Pegasus companies, and I know what they're
Surely,
doing.
if it's the Pegasus program, it should be the flying unicorn builder.
So, and Sally Ann Frank, she heads up the health and life sciences. I recommend you kind of tag her and take a look at what she's doing, and also within the Pegasus program. And she's written a book called The Startup Protocol, which is, if you got a startup and you want to get enter this space, what should you do? And she's just got a new one called the Unicorn Protocol, which will be released in January. And I know about it because I wrote the forward for it. So I recommend you have a look. She's just doing amazing work. And so if you poke around in that system, you'll find like Pangea Data. They've got a technology where they can uncover hard to or misdiagnosed items out of clinical records, so out of existing records, which are missed like 80% of the time, something like that. And so that's a real application where, or AI and generative AI is having some, practical value, right? In fact, I believe they got some kind of a grant from the UK government. I think it was over $1 billion or something, or no, 300 million, I believe. So, but again, just kind of do your own due diligence out there, and you'll just find some amazing work is being done. And then because I have all the Pegasus companies on my laptop, just send an email to me and say, Steve, can you search your laptop? Is there a company that is in this particular space? And I could say, yeah, and then I'll ask Sally if I can get their credentials, and I'll just join you.
That's awesome. Interestingly, you read all the news and you read, I think there's a lot of people that are still not even jumping in on AI and technology yet. I mean, there's a huge faction of that. You have the people that are in the middle that are using it for queries. And then you have the people that really are behind the scenes and know and are driving that development and the potential regulatory environment. I'd say my friends that are in that area of tech, most of them have remote homes and want to be somewhere off the grid when they're worried about. A friend of mine, he sat at dinner with me and he said, I'm really worried about things for my 5-year-old in 2027 with AGI and all this stuff. He's like, literally, you could see the worry on his face. And I'd say there's probably two camps. One is the optimist camp, which is we're going to fix it before it kills us, right? Like, and that's the questions Bill's asking, right? Like, how do we get ahead of it and make sure we're doing it with stewardship and all that? And then there's the other camp, which is we're not going to be able to stop it. And there's this, this AGI world doom kind of mentality. What camp are you in? What are your thoughts on those types of topics that we're hearing out there?
Well, let me tell you a story, and I could only tell you because I wrote an article about it, but it was a work under NDA. I was approached by a group of 100 CEOs back in 2015. Person who was managing strategy said, Stephen, we've been following what you do. Would you be willing to come us and advise us where tech is going in kind of like 5 or 10 and 15 years, something like that, right? I actually initially didn't accept, but finally I did. But even early on at the time, I was saying AI is going to be where it is today. You're going to have a conversational AI that you can interact with, and it's going to do amazing things, right? And I actually back then I said quantum computing will be real in the near term, not 100 years out or 50 years out. And I talked about cybersecurity and that I was going to be a major issue. We talked about privacy and data and biometrics. We talked about distributed finance, and so I was introducing these different topics that they needed to start seriously thinking about. But we also looked at what are the implications of it, like job loss and things like that, and how are you going to manage that. And I can talk about it because they allowed me to write a couple of articles. Not really getting into the detail, but at least you get an idea of some of the topics we covered, right? And my role was to bring innovation and startups to them so that they could make investments and guide them. And really the rationale for them was they saw what Apple did to the phone marketplace, and they realized that can we get disrupted from somebody else that's outside of our ecosystem, and it could happen really quickly, just like Apple from when they announced and released their first iPhone in 2007. Literally within a year, there was kind of the landscape was littered with phone companies, right? Were caught unprepared, right? And so this is their attempt to, I think, manage that. I mean, that's my perspective. But these CEOs at that time represented 92.7 trillion in assets under management. These 100 CEOs, and the GDP of the world at that time was what, 50, 60 trillion, something like that, right? But it's interesting, they were looking at this thing and realizing that, again, this is my view, and you can kind of poke around at search for my name, and you'll see an article in
Yep.
Forbes on the road in IT world, and you can get your own opinion. But I think what they were saying is we can't stop it. So how do we manage it? And then how do we utilize it? How do we do it for tech for good? How do we do it for AI for good or quantum computing for good? How do we do it so it's a productive tool or the technology is used in a productive way? So then you come to this question, where do I sit? I sit that you can't stop it. So how can you manage it? How can you ensure that it's going to be tech for good or AI for good? So keep in mind, if you went back 10 years and if you were to describe AI where it is today, people would have said, that's AGI.
Right.
They would, this is AGI. But because we're getting used to these things, right? Like with Suno, and it writes music for you. We got VO3 and others that generate video with sound. We got, Gemini 2.5 Pro, and you've got Microsoft Copilot. You've got OpenAI in the O4 Mini, but the word is five's coming out, right? Which you don't have to select models; it'll just kind of do things for you. We're now kind of accepting this as what was considered AGI is now we're just accepting it. It's like those 30 mathematicians that came together at Berkeley, and they were shocked, right? Well, what it could do, right? So where am I? It's coming. You're not going to be able to stop it.
So should we buy a compound in the middle of nowhere and hide, or and buy a
Well,
bunch of cans of spam so we can survive whatever's going to happen? Or
I
spam's not
want to
healthy, so we're a health podcast. We can't do.
I want to put a little bit of clarifying nuance on my position on this, right? Because you were saying I'm in the camp of the Skynet is coming and going to kill us, and no, that's not what I'm talking about. Like the thing that gives me comfort from the end of the world immediate doom perspective is that while we've made enormous progress on artificial intelligence and potentially artificial general intelligence, we have made zero progress on artificial sentience. And in order for AI to hold a grudge against a human, it's got to feel something. In fact, it's got to be able to suffer and be aware of its own suffering. And we're just not good at that. Like all of the technology in the world combined has less sentience than your average ant.
So, I mean, that's a great point. So I did two interviews. So it's just search for my name, Stephen Ibaraki, and I did one with Jan LeCun. Now, Jan LeCun, back in 2018, won because I'm part of ACM Turing Award, which is the Nobel Prize in Computing Science. And this year, he won the Queen Elizabeth Engineering Award, which is like the top award in engineering, and because of his pioneering work in AI and neural nets, right? And so if you look at his perspective and where things are going, and he feels we're not quite there yet, right? In fact, he doesn't believe LLMs are the solution, so he's currently working on this JEPA model, this joint embedded predictive architecture. They just came out with a V version of this, which is like a world model, right? Because he doesn't believe LLMs are the solution. He's got to be something or some hybrid or something like that. But I also did an interview with Jeff Hinton. And Jeff
Hmm.
Hinton, if you were to map the AI universe today, they all go back to Jeff at the University of Toronto, right? Because
Yep.
even Jan LeCun spent time with Jeff. Joshua Benjo spent time with Jeff Hinton. And if you went back to ImageNet, so Fifi Lee had this thing called ImageNet, where she had this huge database of images and they were classified, and and then you could apply AI to see how good it was, and it was like 40% of the time make an error, and then it was like 26%, but it was fractional at the end, right? The improvements, and then Jeff Hinton with Ilya Sutskever and Alex, they come up with the AlexNet. They take a team there. They went from like 26 to I think like 13% or something like that. But it was a big jump, and people could not believe it. But because
Yep.
they published their work, they said, why don't you take a look? It's reproducible, right? And so the reason I mention this and Jeff and where he sits is because really a lot of the like Andrew Ng, you'll find he goes back to Jeff Hinton. If you go to Jeff Dean at Google and Google Brain, you'll find there's a connection between him and Jeff Hinton, right? And Jeff Hinton actually,
Jeff Hinton is the guy that if Skynet does happen and they send Reese back from the future into the past to kill someone, it's him.
that's right. So if you search for, so keep in mind, last year he physically picked up the Nobel Prize in December. He got awarded in November, and he picked it up, I believe, in December. And it's in physics for his work in AI, right? With
Yep.
Hopfield. And he had won the Turing Award before that, and he won the Queen Elizabeth Award. And they created a company which they sold to Google when they did this miracle jump. And he was with Google until what, February of 2023, and then he left. So that he felt he wouldn't he could just be himself, right? And if you search for my interview with him, which I conducted this year, you're right. He's saying that, but he's saying more. He's saying that these things will have subjective experience if they don't have ready. So that's kind of like a safe way of saying there's some, they can kind of feel what's happening around them. The issue is, and if you look at what Vinod Khosla is saying, we need embodiment, right? And because then these systems will be able to sense what's happening, and maybe that's the bridge. Now, if you go back to a keynote, and it's available now, I did YPO Edge back in 2019. So YPO is this private organization of CEOs, but they released my talk. If you look at that talk, I talk about how one of the top research, literally the top researcher in brain organoids, which are based on Yamanaka's work, where you can take adult cells and regress them into stem cells, but then you can coax them into being like mini brains and things like that. He was saying that you can create these mini brains and continue to grow them, and they would exhibit electrical signals that would pretty much match a fetus, and then
Yep.
it would plateau and it wouldn't continue. And he thought maybe it's embodiment. It needs embodiment, a scaffolding, things like that, to progress further. And then this kind of ties into this idea that maybe you need the embodiment side to even go this further route or get the ultimate kind of AI. Though, if you look up my interview with Jeff, I think he's suggesting it's going to even happen without the embodiment, right? So, and that. And,
I actually, despite him being so much smarter than me, I disagree with that point of view. I don't think it happens randomly. And I don't think it needs to for AI to be extremely dangerous. It's just, I think insidification is a much more dangerous and much more immediate threat. I'll give you an example. If you had a dating app and it was super effective at getting two people together and them having kids and having a long, and you took that dating app and you said, I actually want a better business model because we have this enormous amount of churn when people get committed, have kids, and they leave. You could take the same data set and match people who will get along for 2.5 years and then split up before they have kids, all right? And they would be happy with the dating app because every 2.5 years they would find someone new, and humanity would quietly go extinct because none of those pairings would breed. And if you think that's too far-fetched, the numbers aren't looking good for us right now.
yeah, I mean,
That is a
there's so many different areas we can go because there's this, kind of like this famous researcher on relationships, and there's these signals that you can detect like in 5 minutes if there's going to be a problem, and we can go down that kind of path. And we can get into Roger Penrose, who's been saying for years that he thinks that no AI in a computer will be to reproduce what we have, because he thinks there's some kind of quantum effect that's happening, right?
I don't think you need to even go that far to the quantum weirdness just to see what the potential real world threat is, just from people not caring about the impact of their business model.
Right.
Like, you want real deaths that have occurred from AI, look at the Rohingya Muslims and how they were persecuted because of news stories that were amplified by Facebook's AI. Straight up, somebody said, hey, get me attention in Myanmar, and people died.
Yeah, we're going to have periods where there's going to be challenges, and that's true of every technological revolution. One of the things that I've been saying, though, and you can track it in the talks I've been giving over the last few years, is that we're reaching a point of convergence and this acceleration that's never happened before. And I'm saying to people it's an inflection point for all of us, for humanity. In fact, beyond humanity, all life on the planet, right? And you better start thinking deeply about what the implications are, right? So and you'll see some of the like Elias Khan. I did an interview with him, which I put into some of my keynotes, and he talks about the implications of quantum. And he has a company called Quantinium. And a year ago, they did this magical thing with Microsoft where they reduced errors by 800 times, which gave them 3 nines fidelity, so 99.9. So kind of like a measure of how error-free it is, right? And now he's working on 5 nines and then 10 nines fidelities. If you look at their roadmap, he feels that they'll have some kind of universal quantum by 2029 with their Apollo model, which means what that means is that it can be used to solve a variety of different problems. Though he's saying, if you look at the interview, or if you look at some of the things that he's posting now, I believe he's saying, and again, I get the audience to look directly, that they're going to be able to solve some areas this year, right? But be niche, but be broader within the next 4 years. And you're seeing other people doing this. DARPA has this contest, and Microsoft is a finalist in the contest. I think IonQ is a finalist. I think Quantinium may be part of that pack, where they've done an analysis of who's out there that may be progressing, where now we have to really pay attention. But keep in mind, NIST back in 2015 put out a competition and saying, let's start thinking about quantum proofing, quantum safe algorithms, right? And those were released now, right? Where some of the ones that they believe can be quantum proof, they've released that now. And this is this National Institute of Standards in the U.S. So you see all of these things happening. But Bill, we had an earlier conversation you talked about the Z80 and how you're playing with the Z80 processor. Federico Fagan he invented the Z80. And if you look at his work, he's a physicist who became a premier designer of chips with Intel. I think he designed 4004, maybe the 8008. Yeah. He may have been involved in the 8080 as well back in the 70s, and then he produced the Z80 and the Z80A, but he's kind of aligned with this Roger Penrose, I think, or I see overlaps between his thinking, and it's this idea of panpsychism, where there's this universal capability and there's a locality of that, and instantiation, and that could be in a human being or somewhere else. But that mean it goes dystopian, and maybe that'll protect us from being dystopian, right? And why can't AI be a locality of this universal consciousness or sentience, or what do you want to call it, right? But maybe we're veering too off, so the audience are now thinking, oh my God, this is like...
I'll bring that home for you, though. I don't think that'll save us, because if you spend like a couple of days in the Australian bush, you pretty much work out that nature is not utopian.
That's true.
Everything there wants to kill you, most of it pretty horribly.
So
amazing.
I guess the question is, are we in a time period where are we going to continue in our current form, or are we going to be some kind of hybrid? So in my keynotes, I actually talk about there's classical human beings like all of us here. Some of us are augmented. For example, I have hearing aids and they have AI embedded in, so I'm augmented. I was at a conference with a lady, and she had 2 fully articulated bionic arms. So I would say she's hybrid. And she agreed. She says, yeah, you can say I'm hybrid. And then we have autonomous, right? We already have autonomous vehicles. If you look at the Figure AI, their Helix model, which is the vision language action model, it can, to me, it has some generalization kind of capability, right? So now we're getting into the sort of semi-autonomous robotics, the sort of embodiment into robotics. And that's if you look at the Vinod Khosla interview, he's saying it's going to do unimaginable things even within a few years, right? And then there's like
What
going to be a billion of these things integrating with us after that, right? So,
one of the big leaps forward for that isn't actually quantum computing, it's analog photonic computing, because they've now got very easily lithographical photonic substrates that can do large analog computations
right.
using these tiny little waveguides that they put onto the chip surface. And the beauty of that is, of course, it generates very little heat. So you have immense compute on a very, very cool, low power footprint. And if you're gonna embody things and you're gonna add compute to to people and augmentation, you really need something that's as low power as a brain, low power demand as a brain, in order to be able to do this stuff. So that's a very exciting, somewhere between traditional silicon and quantum. There's a very exciting new area that's going to open up.
Yeah, in fact, that's the area that Jeff Hinton was working on before he left Google was can he create a kind of an analog version because of the reduction in power requirements, right? But he, in doing, and again, this is kind of hearsay in a sense, right? So I recommend you go directly to what he's saying or go to my interview. But what he came to a realization that he thinks digital, even though it's not as efficient, can outdo us. And then what does that mean? What are the implications of that? And the idea of photonics and what that could mean, there's all probabilistic and thermodynamic computing that potentially could be 100 million times more capable than GPUs, and there's already companies working in this area. I did a keynote back in 2016 at the International Conference on Software Engineering. It's co-hosted by ACM, which is number one in computing science, and IEEE, which is number one in technology engineering, and also the National Science Foundation. But because it's a formal academic conference, I had to produce the abstracts for it, things the year before. But my deck is still there, the International Conference on Software Engineering from 2016. I actually talk about all of this. And even AI and quantum computing, and I talk about photonics and CRISPR and the impact it's going to have. And I can tell you this, I was approached back in 2014 if I could reach out to Elon, and because they wanted it for a keynote. We couldn't get Elon to do the keynote. I said, well, Steve, would you be willing to take it on? So I said, but I will do it if I talk about the future. And they said, no, that won't work with this group because they're software engineers, right? And even to the day I did the keynote, they were saying, Steven, modify your keynote, soften it. And I said, no, but you know what? It was supposed to be like a 45-minute keynote, being an hour and a half. It worked because I gave them citable stuff. I gave them practical areas they can go to. I gave them evidence to show that. And really, if you look at that keynote, because the deck is still there, it's where we are today. And I was predicting where we are today. And I said it's going to impinge on your work as software developers. So
That's
you're
amazing.
aware of this, right?
So the category, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time and certainly kind of bring a few things home. You talked about your keynote. Talk about the road ahead for where we're going, just in near term, maybe 3, 5, 10, 12 years out. I know you've been way ahead of the curve here. Love to hear your thoughts around where we're going.
So I believe you can't predict 20 years out because there's too much happening within the next 5, 10 years. And that too much happening. So let me kind of give you a story, right? And this is sometimes I throw this out to when I do keynotes. Imagine a parrot on a fence. And we know parrots, they can problem solve, or at least corvids, blackbirds and things like that can problem solve. And their brain structure is a little bit different, and yet, or octopi, right? They can problem solve. But can they contemplate, or maybe they can, they contemplate quantum gravity collapse and singularities and universe and probably, I'm thinking maybe they can't, right? And it's just because the computational capabilities just aren't there, right? Well, we represent our current computational capabilities. We in this finite brain, and there's 80 to 100 billion neurons, and I estimate now 250 trillion computational capabilities. You'll see people saying 100 trillion, but it's much bigger than that because now we can see some computation happening even at the cellular level without neurons, something else going on. So I think it's much bigger. But still, we have limitations. Now, can you imagine with the convergence of quantum and AI and chip technologies, photonic chips, ballistic analog computing, biomedical innovation, all these things, robotics and automation, all of these things converging, all at the same, and flywheel kind of amplifying each other, then we could have our intelligence or our capabilities or multidimensional thinking expanded 1,000 times, maybe 1,000,000,000,000 times. But now we're the parrot that's sitting on the fence because we can't think in that dimensional space that way. That's why I think it's interesting because you can use sparse autoencoders and other technology to kind of get a sense of what's happening in these LLM latent spaces, and you can see organization happening and multidimensional something's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what if we're expanded a septillion times, then 10 to the 24th time? We can't even imagine what that is and what our perspective of reality is and causality. And, there's the Higgs field, the Higgs boson, which it looks like it exists, and the Higgs field allows matter, right? But what if at that level, there's other things beyond where we have the ability to manipulate these things or laws of physics that we can't comprehend because we're too limited. Well, that I'm predicting that's going to happen in the next short term, and that's why we can't predict 20 because we're going to have this kind of unlimited capability, right? And I've been saying this
That's
for a long, long time, and this is the era we're living in.
It's a fun era, I think. I think it's quite impactful to see the speed of change we're having today. I think in our space, it's happening fast as well, which is exciting. Now we just need the medical community to catch up to it, right? The medical latency and all that stuff. So amazing. You do amazing things. And for you personally, what's next with Red's Capital, AI for Good, and the broader innovation ecosystem in your mind? So knowing what you can't predict, what's next for you? What are the big things on your radar?
So because a lot of the work I do is under NDA or I'm bound by some kind of security envelope, then I can't talk about a lot of it. But what I can do is,
Well, if you told us we'd get, somebody to show up at our door or something, what's happening?
what I can do is, right, because I'm embedded in ACM, as I mentioned, I'm being on the board committee since
Totally.
2009, and we have these daily news briefs, and I'm saying pay attention to them. And I'm saying IEEE, we have
Yeah.
the IEEE spectrum, pay attention to them. And if you look at some of my keynotes, like I'm saying pay attention to them because they're going to give you a picture of where things are going. And then even before AI for Good, the first summit was in June of 2017, right? But I bought the idea in something in March or May of 2016. And then I went on the road to try to support them, and it was pro bono, right? There's a video, an unscripted video at one of the conferences where they asked me to do the entire day. So I did one on financial services and the impact of digital, and then I did one on AI. So I brought in the speakers, I moderated, I opened with a short keynote, things like that. And then on the sidelines of this conference, it was an UN ITU conference called the World Technology Systems Alliance or something like that, right? But there's a video from, if you type in Stephen Ibaraki 2016 ITU, actually, I didn't prep it, they just asked me questions. Where do you think AI is going? And I'm telling you, everything I said back in 2016 is where we are. Have a look.
So we need to listen to you. Yeah.
I did have a
We need to
look
listen
and
to you
some of
more.
my questions.
So,
Amazing. So quick, we have a few last questions I want to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. You're listening in this audience, somebody's listening to you and saying, well, we can't predict where we're going to be. And you've been predicting for a lot of years. What advice would you give younger generation besides procreate? We need more procreation in the world, as Bill was alluding to earlier. And what would you give to somebody who's living through this? I mean, we didn't have iPhones when I was growing up, right? This is a different generation. So when you start to think about it, what do you tell somebody to do? Is it jump in head first, get ahead, learn, read the encyclopedia, go back to paper? What would it be? So I'm curious of your take.
I was asked to speak several times at GITEX last year. GITEX in Dubai, GITEX Global. It's the world's largest innovation investment startup conference. We had over 200,000 attendees, and 40% were C-level of some sort, right? And they asked me to produce a video. So if you search for my name, and GITEX Dubai Global. It's on LinkedIn. I actually give you tips on how to prepare. I give you like 5 tips on how to prepare for the future. Let me just summarize maybe just a few of them, right? So you need to spend time, like Vinod Khosla does, reading about what's on the edge. And how do you sort through the billion data points that are dropped every day and what's noise and what's not? Then you go to trusted or the most trusted sources that are out there. ACM, Association for Computing Machine, we're number one in computing science. We have a daily news feed. IEEE, we're the number one organization in technology engineering, right? And we have the IEEE spectrum. And they're constant feeds about where things are going from the two most reputable organizations in the world today. So you can get some of this free, but what if you want to become a member? We're nonprofits. You can join the ACM for under $100 a year. And the IEEE costs more, but it's maybe $300 a year or something like that, right? So why, do you think it's worth an investment? It's like a cup of coffee, right? If you have a cup of coffee a week, pay for it's the same kind of idea, right? It's worth it. And these organizations, we have the top conferences in the world, the top journals in the world, we have the top people in the world working with us. And in fact, the current chair of Alphabet, Ron Hennessy, he belongs to these organizations. He's the chair of a Magic 7 company. He's 16 years president of Stanford. He's won our Turing Award, which is the Nobel Prize in Computing Science. Won the Medal of Honor, which is the IEEE kind of equivalent. He's a really famous investor. He's been on the Forbes Midas Touch list. He's a member of these organizations. Jensen Huang is a member of these organizations. In fact, Jensen Huang, in the early days, he needed to present papers and publish and speak at SIGGRAPH, which is a sub-organization that's called the Special Interest Group for Graphics, the number one graphics organization in the world. But it's a sub-organization of ACM. So you're going to see the future so I'm giving you tips, right? So embrace the future, read about it, spend some time looking at those daily news feeds and thinking about it. Now, how do you think about it? Then you practice something called combinatorial thinking. And combinatorial thinking is, I pick something up here, I'm going into my soccer practice, and I think about what's happening there, and I think, how are there some kind of relationships between the two? So you're spending time with your music friends, your art friends, your investor friends, your entrepreneurial friends. You're talking with your I don't know if people go to barbershops anymore, but I've been one for a long time. But if you go to your hairdresser or something, you talk to your hairdresser about different ideas, and then spend time when you're out for a walk or in the shower or going, spend time just kind of combining these different outlier ideas with the different other experiences. That's combinatorial thinking. And that combinatorial thinking will make you agile. So practice agility through this combinatorial and resilience. And we're all entrepreneurs here, right? And when you're on the entrepreneurial journey, when you start something, it's just perfectly smooth. Everything just goes 100%. No, it's volatile, right? So you have to practice volatility and resilience, and then being optimistic through those resilience. And when you have a problem come up, don't think of the problem as a challenge that can't be met. Then use these concepts like what this multi-LLM adaptive branching, multicolor integration, this Sakana system does, right? What I mean is stepwise refinement. In other words, you have a big problem, break it up into small steps, sample different solutions for those small steps, optimize to the optimum solution. And in that way, no matter how big the problem is, you'll either gain lessons from it or you'll actually solve it. And that's part of the resilience part, right? So resilience, optimism, agility, combinatorial thinking, and read on the edge, and you'll master the tsunami. And if you go back to my
Steven, you're making me more optimistic by the second. Like, this is how I'm feeling right now. It's an optimistic outlook. And I agree with it. I know Bill does too in a lot of ways. Humanity wants to do good, I think, at the root of it all. And those are really good suggestions. I'd say you've suggested so many people that book or person like that shaped you. We have a few that you've interviewed, but also probably some. But is there one that stands out to you?
That's really interesting. When I do a keynote, I actually give a list of books I recommend.
Now, if you had to pick one, what would they do? We're going to look them up and put them in the show notes if that's something you're
What
okay with, then we'll do that. Some content for people.
I can send you the slide, which I inserted in
Okay.
my note. And so there isn't really one because it depends. If I'm a company and I want to embrace AI, then I recommend Ready Melody because Ready Melody has repeatedly implemented AI into companies and then he's written a book about how he did it. So that's if you want to implement AI successfully and then you got a big company, he'll tell you how to do it. If you're an executive or somebody who just wants to implement, and no matter what the size of the company, there's a gentleman named Bruke, and he sits on the ACM board with me. In fact, now he's taken over my role of the board committee, the ACM board committee called the Professional Development Committee. His name is Bruke Kifle, but he's written a book also because he used to teach this at MIT. I'm an executive or somebody, I want to implement AI. So he's got a systems approach. And then he said, why not I put that into, and he's really young, like he's in his 20s, it's just it's really, really young. But I got to list the book. So if you're an investor, I've got another book that was written by an amazing investor out of Europe. She's won repeatedly. That's kind of like top investor in Europe and things. And she's got a great entrepreneurial background. And then she's very thoughtful and the kinds of investment. And she's invested in quantum and things like that. So she'll give you her playbook in that sense, right? So I can send that to you, and that could be the audience's playbook for the different areas that. In fact, I'll send you my whole
We'll do that.
section, right?
That's
That would be
great.
amazing, and we'll be happy to share that. I'll tell you that's a great amount of information for the listeners. Now you got to give me one of these, just one, because you've got a lot of really amazing answers. But what keeps you grounded? One habit, one thing. I look at your schedule. You sent us your schedule leading up to this. I'm not going to tell everybody where you're going to be for the next 90 to 120 days, but it's crazy. It's a lot of, you're going, and we all travel, but how do you stay grounded with all of that?
I stay, and so that's a great question. And the great question is if you live in what I call service, then you'll stay grounded. So my role in the world is just to serve others, serve the needs of the UN or serve these academic associations that I'm part of, or to serve entrepreneurs and investors like yourself. So my role in life is service. And in that way, I can stay like a human being, right? I can stay like. The other thing too is have a perspective that our abilities and attributes sit across over a million different dimensions, right? And try not to think of yourself as above somebody else, but because we're really all equal. And even though, because there's so many dimensions to a person, you may not realize all of the capabilities. So it's like we're all the same. And then spend time thinking about the other and their perspective. So spend time in the other person's perspective and try to understand it and respect it, right? So even though it may be contrary to who you think you are, spend time thinking about the other and honoring.
Perspective's a powerful tool, very powerful tool, no question. That's a great one. Last question. Who should we have on this podcast? You said about 30 people that we're going to take notes on, but we generally ask our last guest who we should have on next if we can or soon thereafter. And is there anyone that would stand out to you?
There's so many, but there's a YPOer, and he's public about it, so that's why I can mention it, right? His name is Kowach, and he's the Director of Global Acceleration and Venture at the World Food Program. And so he runs their Innovation Accelerator. He's very thoughtful. And the World Food Program is the world's largest UN agency by budget. They have the largest logistics program. For example, they have 100 aircraft, 30 ships, 7,000 vehicles, 22,000 people around the world. And they run the largest accelerator program, covering healthcare, climate, energy, transportation, food, ag tech. And in fact, I'm a founder of their advisory council, right? In fact, we have a meeting coming up, and some of our portfolio companies, for example, in December 2023, won the Earthshot Prize. So ones that we were supporting, which is the top impact prize, right? It's £1 million each. So just great work. And so he can give you the innovation side, the acceleration side. He can give you the YPO perspective and why he joined YPO and the advantages of joining that community. And then what the World Food Program is doing from an innovation standpoint. For example, they've invested in autonomous vehicles because sometimes when you want to deliver food in a really dangerous area, it's safer to use an autonomous vehicle than go there personally, right? Things like that. And they definitely have invested in companies and startups and things like that that are really innovative in healthcare, which is your sweet spot, right? And with some amazing new tech. So
it's a great suggestion.
Ask
Before we wrap it up,
same question. I ask the same question, just with a slight tweak, which is who would be the most amazing woman for us to have on the podcast? Because so far we've had a lot of recommendations of other men.
if you can get her, I did David, the past executive director of the World Food Program, and then Cindy McCain was then appointed the executive director of the World Food Program, and that's the Senator McCain, the spouse of Senator McCain, but she's just got a great background. I mean, her family's one of the most successful families in the U.S., and she chairs that company that they have, and then of course she runs the largest UN agency, right, as well. And she's big on innovation. She's very thoughtful and impactful. And maybe an idea is to have Bernard and Cindy at the same time.
oh, that'd be fun.
Awesome.
That sounds good too. Have you ever interviewed Suzanne Gildaire? She would be an interesting one for talking about consciousness, Bill. She's a potential. She thinks robots will be a long way from consciousness. She agrees with.
Yeah, I think that they may become conscious. I still don't think they may become sentient.
That's
Yeah.
so keep in mind,
Fair.
do plants have some kind of capability that we don't understand, but they have this capability?
Oh, plants definitely have sentience. If you do a high speed, if you do time lapse, you can actually see plants reaching out towards things, pulling back from threats. And then if you look at time lapse of a mycelial network where all the plants in a forest are connected by the fungi, they make very, very clear that they are suffering or that there's a threat. There's definitely sentience there. It's just very slow.
Yeah, and again, we're losing some of the audience, right? Because this is, I think I encourage people to think in much broader terms, right? So there's now an appreciation of indigenous knowledge than there was before, right? There's a greater appreciation of the diversity of capability, of computational capability in the biological sense. And then, in fact, there's an area that's kind of on the outlier called quantum biology. And Clarice Ayello, I would say, is probably the top researcher right now. So that work there's more going on in organizations, and if you can tap it, you can do all sorts of wonderful things, right? So, and she's got experiments that are running, and you can actually see them on the net. She's very transparent about her work, and I can do an introduction if you wish. And
Awesome.
That would be great.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
I'm very fascinated by quantum biology.
Yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating.
Well, with that, Stephen, first I want to thank you for coming on. It's a complete pleasure to hear what you've been doing, what you've been up to, and all the prognostication that was before and how right you were and where things are going. All the recommendations, we welcome them and we're thankful for that. And great to have you on here. How would our guests follow you? We'll put some things in the show notes. I know LinkedIn is active and a lot of communication methods. What's the best way, in your opinion, for them to follow you?
Yeah, probably the best way is to follow my LinkedIn. So I should mention that I've been at the maximum 30K contacts for like forever. LinkedIn. And people don't realize this, that the maximum first level contacts you can have in LinkedIn is 30,000. That's it. And so
you have to cut people to add people.
I have to get rid of people to add people. That's right. And that's hard to do.
Yeah.
And especially because I've been it's like the beginning. So, and
we'll make sure to put your LinkedIn in and things you said. And really, again, we're thankful and grateful for your time. And for the audience, we've got great guests, including clinicians and things coming up. So we're excited about the next upcoming episodes, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thanks for joining.
And thank you to Todd and Bill for the invitation. So it's a real pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve.